Prime Minister at this time asked the king to allow him either to offer peace to the Americans or to accept his resignation. The king said, neither one. I will not accept your resignation. I need you to continue leading the government, but we're also not going to offer peace. We're going to keep fighting.
All right, George is digging in his heels, but does it pay off?
Well, we'll see. The French, meanwhile, before even the battle had even started, for a couple of years, the French had been negotiating with the Americans and providing them with supplies secretly using shell corporations and what we would call today shell corporations and just other sneaky means. They had been sneaking in supplies, not a whole lot, but some, since 1775. But the French were reluctant to help the Americans at first until the Americans could prove that they were unified and that they could defeat the British. This might just do the trick. Congress had sent a delegation to France consisting of John Adams, Silas Deane, and Benjamin Franklin to negotiate. And Franklin had gone first and been there by himself quite some time prior to the arrival of Adams and Deane. I think you and I talked about this in a previous episode, Scott. I can't remember how Franklin goes over there and he's wearing a fur hat and just really rustic clothing and acting like he's this country guy, this typical American who's a man of the wilderness and all that, which he was nothing of the kind.
No, not at all. He lived in a city his entire life.
Yeah, and he went over there and he charmed the women, the older women. He's a very old man at this point. He's almost 70. In fact, he turned 70 in 1776. And his French is not that good. But nevertheless, the people of Paris just fall in love with them. And so he's negotiating with them. And Adams joins him and this other fellow, Silas Deane. And finally, this victory, this American victory, major victory, basically wiped a complete British army off the map, gone, at least seemingly. The American victory at Saratoga, it motivated France to finally take the plunge. So France agrees to sign a treaty of alliance and assistance with the United States. This is huge, Scott. We cannot overemphasize how important this is. The Americans now have an ally, probably the second best Navy in the world, second or possibly first, the best army, a very good army, professional French army. They're going to come in on this side of the Americans. Now, they're going to take forever, but it's going to be very frustrating to the Americans, but at least they are going to help. Officially now, not sneaky stuff, but actually sending over ships and men and lots of guns. And so this completely changes the nature of the war. It turns a colonial rebellion into a world war. And that's something we need to really stress, I think, Scott, because prior to this, it was just British versus British colonists, right? It was just a kind of a local thing, a little rebellion in North America that grew to a big rebellion. But now it's France versus Britain all over again. And the French, they've really been kind of looking forward to an opportunity to get revenge on the British for kicking them out of North America and defeating them in the French and Indian War. The French have a huge chip on their shoulder against the British, and they're ready to deal out some payback. And now the British have to watch out for the French all over the world, literally. For example, how do they know the French might not try to invade Britain? They might cross the English Channel and land in Great Britain. It's possible. I mean, it would be very difficult, but it's certainly possible. So they have to now put some forces in the English Channel to make sure we don't have a redo of William the Conqueror. They've got to watch out now in the West Indies. There's always a big rivalry between France and Britain in the West Indies. Other parts of the world, India, the Far East, there's all kinds of places where fighting is now going to break out, as well as Europe, continental Europe. So now the British are going to have to start spreading out their forces a lot more than they did before. And so for this reason, the reason that Saratoga leads directly to the intervention of the French on the side of the Americans, Saratoga is considered to be the turning point of the war. Now, Scott and I talked in our Civil War series about turning points, and we came to the conclusion that there wasn't a single turning point. When I was in school, they said, Gettysburg was the turning point of the war and all that. But no, it wasn't. But It's hard to argue against this. It's hard to argue that Saratoga was not a turning point. I mean, I'm sure you could make that argument, but I can't think of another moment where things changed so quickly. You went from, again, just being a colonial, an internecine struggle between British and other British. Now the French are involved. So it's really a world war. The French are going to end up really helping the Americans, not to give too much away.
Right. This is something that it can't be overstated how important it is. And when we talked earlier about the 7 Years' War, people typically mention the French and Indian War to set up the Revolutionary War, but that was just the North American theater of the global war that's happening. And this can be considered almost an extension of the 7 Years' War, where these fault lines between the French and the British that are still there, the French are trying to exploit. And if you remember from our Civil War series, we mentioned that the Confederates really took a lot of cues from the Revolutionary War. They thought, this is a battle that is starting as a civil war, which you could consider the Revolutionary War to be that, because it's British colonists, British subjects of the British Empire fighting the British. And the Confederates thought, well, let's win a resounding battle. If we win a resounding battle, we could get foreign support, probably from England, much in the way that the Americans got foreign support from the French when they proved their mettle. So this is at least the Confederate blueprint using the Revolutionary War to try to win.
Yep, this definitely sets the standard and gives hope to the later rebels, the other rebels that we talked about in our previous series. One other thing I want to mention that I think is just kind of interesting, kind of side note here. After the Battle of Saratoga, a new United States flag debuted. Before this, the U.S. flag was essentially the flag of the UK, the United Kingdom or British flag in the top left corner, and then the 13 stripes. But after this, they figure, well, let's get rid of the British flag. We're not British anymore. We're different. So they unveiled the famous flag, which has actually been in the news lately. There's been some controversy over it, which is, it's hard to imagine. I don't get that. But anyway, I don't want to get into politics, but by the way, we're recording this in July of 2019. Who knows when people will be listening to this, Scott? But just to give a little context to that. This new flag has 13 red and white stripes, as the previous one did. But instead of the British flag in the top left corner, there's a circular pattern of 13 stars, 1 star for each colony. That's in the upper left-hand corner. So there you go. What do you think, Scott?
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, this is an interesting story about the Betsy Ross flag, because if you look at her page on Wikipedia, there's a famous painting where she and an assistant are holding up the flag in front of George Washington, and Washington is standing with the noble erect posture that he had when he was on that boat crossing the Delaware River.
Yeah.
Great painting. Again, not at all like anything that happened. Betsy Ross, there are many questions about how involved she was in the design of this flag, because the sources that we have about her involvement aren't that solid. Now, just a little bit of background about her. She is an upholsterer in Philadelphia. She is a Quaker and an abolitionist. That brings some irony to this kerfuffle in July 2019 that we have. And Pennsylvania was an abolitionist state when it entered the Union. Anyway, but she produced uniforms, tents, and flags for Continental forces, and she represents the contribution of women in America. The questions about her involvement in the design of the flag are that the National Museum of American History notes that the story of her making the flag practically single-handedly, it came in the 1876 Centennial Exposition celebrations when Ross's grandson, William Canby, presented a paper to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania where he claims that his grandmother had made with her hands the first flag of the United States. And Canby says that he first obtained this information from his aunt, Clarissa Wilson, in 1857, 20 years after Betsy Ross dies. So in his account, the original flag was made in June 1776, when a small committee, including George Washington and Robert Morris and relative George Ross, visited Betsy Ross and discussed the need for a new American flag. This story is a little bit fantastical. It's almost like in Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich, written in the 1920s. Napoleon Hill was a bit of a huckster, and he basically made up the story where he's talking with President Wilson right after the conclusion of World War I, and Wilson is saying, "What am I going to do, Napoleon?" As if like Napoleon Hill is giving direct advice to the commander-in-chief about global affairs following the conclusion of the Great War. And this story of Betsy Ross kind of smacks of that too, where, the commander-in-chief right in the middle of the war go to her upholstery shop and commission personally for her a flag design. And then the story goes that she accepts the job. She alters the committee's design by replacing 6-pointed stars with 5-pointed stars. But we don't have any proof of this. What we do know is that she was one of several flag makers in Philadelphia, and her contribution does seem to be changing 6-pointed stars to the easier to design 5-pointed stars, not so much symbolic. So one more thing, James, this kind of seems to be a running motif here. This is a question of historiography, of how history is made. And it seems like a lot of the romantic elements of the Revolutionary War, of Nathan Hale stating, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." One of the commanders shouting victory or death, and these very noble, larger-than-life things of Betsy Ross making the flag, they seem to be coming out in the 19th century, specifically after the Civil War. I don't know if it's a patriotic project of uniting the United States, or it's adding kind of a heroic gloss over them. I don't really know the details or the historiographical argument. Do you know much about this, about how these kind of embellishments of, I cannot tell a lie, George Washington, chops down a cherry tree but can't lie. Is this part of the 19th century, or what's this all about?
I think it's nation building through myth making. I think now the whole thing, the I cannot tell a lie and the chopping down the cherry tree and all that was much earlier. That was in the 1820s, 30s. It was from a biography by a parson or a pastor, Mason Weems. And the other things, I'm not really sure about the exact dates when the legend of Betsy Ross came up, but all these, as you mentioned, were much later than the Revolutionary War. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of this was really, if not invented, if it was really talked up and kind of solidified into American sacred tradition around the centennial. Think about 1876. The Reconstruction was coming to an end. The Civil War had been over for quite a while. And I think a lot of people did want to bind the nation together to some extent. And so I think this could play a big role in that. I mean, why not? Let's talk about the Revolution instead of the Civil War.
Yeah, that's a pro tip for listeners. If you're wondering where a lot of myths come from, look at when was the time when a lot of the histories were written about a specific time. Mm-hmm. So, for example, just to take something completely different, a lot of medieval history is distorted because it's looked at through the prism of the Victorian era, when a lot of medieval works are being made. And ideas about medievals thinking that the world was flat, a lot of it comes from anti-Catholic Protestant dogma of the 19th century, and proper medieval ladies who wear their hennin, their traffic cone hat, and look wistfully out the window. Their manners are based on a Victorian lady. So a lot of the myth-making in the Middle Ages comes because many of these works come from the Victorian era. And like you said, James, many of these works come from the centennial. So there is that element that's kind of glossed over. So the way that history is sort of flattened and mythologized can come due to historiographical considerations like this. So anyway, that's my academic fancy pants little segue there. But I think this brings us to a close. Anything else on Saratoga?
No, we've put Saratoga to bed. It's a great, fun battle to talk about. It's obviously, if you're an American, it's a lot of fun it's fun because we win. We win overwhelmingly, and of course, it's going to bring in the French, which is going to make the Americans' situation even better. So next time we're going to talk about what is George Washington and what are General William Howe doing while all this is going on. They were not involved in this, of course. This occurred far to the north. General Howe is still in New York City, but as we saw earlier, Burgoyne wanted him to come up and help him near Albany, But instead, Howe had his own idea, and Howe decided he was going to go take Philadelphia, which is the rebel capital. And maybe that